the first dry afternoon of October, and the road to the village had filled with carriages that did not stop. Clorinda stood at the gate of Marlbeck Court in a gown of unrelieved black, a basket of bread cooling against her hip, and watched the Herrenby landau slow at the bend. The two ladies inside turned their faces to the hedgerow, and the coachman touched his whip to the horses, so they would not have to suffer the indignity of passing her at a walk. She had loaded the basket herself that morning. She had meant it for the widow Estcourt, whose chimney had cracked in the September gales, and whose 3 children coughed through the nights. None of that was visible from a passing carriage. From a passing carriage, there was only a woman in black at a gate, and the thing the whole county had agreed she was. She did not flinch. She had taught herself not to flinch in the 11 weeks since the funeral, the way a person learns to hold a scalding cup until the burning becomes a kind of grip. The landau cleared the bend and was gone, and the dust it raised settled slowly over the verge, and somewhere beyond the wall a thrush went on singing, as though nothing in the world had been decided. What the county had decided was this. N.A. That she had married the old Duke of Marlbeck for his coronet and his consols and his seat in the Lords, that she had nursed him through the last wasting spring with one hand while the other reached for the inkstand and the will, and that when his breath finally failed on a wet night in July she had stood at the bedside and counted, not grieved. They did not say it to her face. They did not need to. It traveled in the spaces between civilities, in the way a footman's eyes slid past her, in the silence that opened around her name like water closing over a dropped stone. She had been the Duchess of Marlbeck for 2 years and 4 months. For most of that time she had been invisible, which was its own kind of safety. Now she was the most visible woman in 3 counties, and entirely alone. Stay with me for the length of a single season, and you will see how she answered them. Not with a denial. A denial is what the guilty offer, and she knew it. And so did they. She had come to him at 21, the daughter of a clergyman of good blood and no fortune, Wexbury of the Shropshire. Wexbury's a name that opened a parish register and very few doors. Her mother was dead. Her father had a living worth 200 a year and a study full of sermons no one would print. When the old Duke, a widower of 63 with a bad chest and a worse heart, had seen her reading aloud to the almshouse women at the Calbourne fete, and asked, 3 weeks later, whether she would consider an arrangement that would shock everyone and suit them both. She had not pretended it was a love match. Neither had he. He had wanted a companion of intelligence for the years he had left, and a mind he could trust with the running of an estate his nephew could not be permitted to touch. She had wanted her father comfortable, and a roof that did not leak. They had shaken hands on it like 2 reasonable adults, and then over the slow seasons, something gentler than either had bargained for had grown up between them, the affection of a clever girl and a tired, honest man. And she had nursed him at the end, not for the inkstand, but because she had come to love him in the plain way one loves what one has chosen to be loyal to. None of that could be seen from the road. Either the nephew was the difficulty. The nephew was always going to be the difficulty. His name was Quintrell Galsworth, and he was the late Duke's sister's son, and from the hour the bells of Calbourne rang the passing he had behaved as a man who had waited a long time for a door to open. He was 39, florid, expensively dressed, perennially in debt to men who had stopped being patient. The dukedom was entailed, the title and the principal seat passing to him by law, as the nearest male heir, and that much she had never contested. The old Duke, however, had been careful. The unentailed estate, the Calbourne farms and the dower house and the funds that actually paid for the bread in her basket, he had settled on Clorinda outright, in a deed drawn 3 years before his illness, witnessed and sealed and lodged with his man of business in town. Quintrell would have the coronet and the crumbling pile and the seat in the Lords. He would not have the money, and without the money, the coronet was a stone tied to a drowning man. He had come to Marlbeck Court a fortnight after the funeral, walked the rooms as though pricing them, and stood in the long library with his hat still on his head, and told her with a smile that the deed would not stand, that a dying man's signature coaxed from him by a young wife with everything to gain, was the sort of thing a sympathetic chancery court set aside every term. That she would find the world had a long memory and a short patience for women of her sort. "And what sort is that?" she had said very quietly, her hands folded. He had looked at her then with something that was almost admiration, and entirely without mercy. "The clever kind," he said. "The kind who marries an old man in March, and buries him in July and calls it devotion. Take the dower house, cousin. Take it and be grateful, and be gone. Marlbeck does not want a poisoner at its gate." That was the first time she heard the word said aloud. Poisoner. He set it down between them in the empty library, like a card turned face up, and watched to see whether she would weep or fly at him, and she did neither. She rang for his carriage. When the door had shut behind him, though, she sat down in the old Duke's chair, the one with the worn place on the arm where his hand had rested. And she found she could not get her breath, and she understood for the first time the size of the thing that was coming for her. He had not merely insulted her, he had named the weapon he meant to use. In the weeks that followed, she learned how a rumor is built, because she watched him build it. He did not shout the word in the street. He was cleverer than that. He took rooms at the Calbourne Inn, and bought wine for the men who had attended the old Duke, the apothecary's boy, the undergroom, a discharged nurse with a grievance and a thirst. He let it be understood that he, the grieving nephew, harbored doubts he was too gentlemanly to voice. Doubts a man could only hint at over a third glass. He paid the apothecary, Mr. Etta, Taverner, a sum no one ever named aloud. And shortly afterward, Mr. Toller. Taverner's ledger for the spring months, the record of every grain and powder dispensed to Marlbeck Court, was found to be water-damaged past reading in the precise stretch of weeks that mattered. He produced, from somewhere, a physician's affidavit. Dr. Hollard of the next county, a man Clorinda had never met, and the old Duke had never consulted, swore on paper that the symptoms of the late Duke's decline were consistent with the slow administration of a vegetable poison. Quintrell did not publish it. He let it be known that it existed. An existing document, carefully unshown, does more work than a printed one a man can examine and refute. By Michaelmas the county had its verdict, and the carriages no longer stopped. She might have fought it loudly. She had the deed, she had the truth, she had the old Duke's own physician, a decent overworked man named Marsworth, who had signed the death as a failure of the heart after a long pulmonary decline. She understood, with the cold clarity that had always been her one real fortune, that a loud defense from a suspected woman is heard as a confession. With better grammar, the world had decided she was guilty. The world would not be argued out of a verdict. It found so satisfying. The world would have to be shown something it could not unsee. So she went quiet, and while she was quiet, she worked. This is the part the carriages could not see, and it is the part that mattered. Clorinda had not spent 2 years at Marlbeck as an ornament. The old Duke, finding her arithmetic better than his steward's and her judgment better than his own, had by slow degrees handed her the running of the unentailed estate, and she had run it well. She knew which of the Calbourne farms was over-rented, and which tenant had buried a wife and fallen behind through grief rather than idleness. She knew the drainage of the low meadows and the price of seed corn, and the name of every child on the home farm. When the September gales took the widow Estcourt's chimney, it was Clorinda who sent the mason, and Clorinda who paid him. When the rumor turned the village cold toward her, the work did not stop. She rose before the maids, and went over the accounts by candle, and she walked the farms in her black gown with her basket, and she met the averted eyes in the muttered word, and she went on setting cracked chimneys to rights, because the bread was real, and the rumor was not, and she had decided that the difference between them would be her whole argument. "The poisoner Duchess walks the lanes as bold as brass," she heard a woman say to another at the Calbourne pump, not troubling to lower her voice the morning Clorinda passed with the basket, setting Mary Estcourt's chimney as though that buys her back, her soul. The two women watched her go by. Clorinda inclined her head to them as a duchess inclines her head, and walked on, and did not let them see her hand tighten on the basket's handle until the knuckles whitened. It was the middle of November when the letter came that changed the shape of the season. It was from town. From a hand she did not know, the paper good and the seal a crest. She had to fetch the book to identify. The Marquis of Brightwell. She knew the name as everyone knew it, the way one knows the name of a mountain one has never climbed. Lattimore, Marquess of Brightwell, was 34, unmarried, possessed of an old fortune unencumbered by debt, and trusted, at court, in a way that had nothing to do with display. He carried no office anyone could envy, and every duty no one else could be relied upon to perform. When the crown needed a delicate question looked into by a man who could not be bought and could not be flattered, it was Brightwell who was asked. He was known to be cold. He was known to be exact. He was not known to write to disgraced young widows in the country, and yet here was his letter, brief and level, requesting the honor of waiting upon her grace at her earliest convenience on a matter touching the late Duke's affairs. She read it 3 times. Then she wrote back that he might come on Thursday, and she did not let herself wonder why her heart had quickened, because she had no room left for hope, and could not afford to grow one. He came on Thursday. The library was the only warm room, and she received him there, and he was nothing she had braced for. He was tall and spare, with the kind of stillness that made a room rearrange itself around him, dark hair cut close, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, and gray eyes that took in the worn place on the arm of the old Duke's chair, the careful economy of the fire, the account book closed but not hidden on the table. Before they came to rest on her face, he bowed. He did not smile. When he spoke, his voice was low and without ornament, the voice of a man who had never in his life needed to raise it. "Your Grace," he said, "you will forgive a stranger's intrusion. I served with the late Duke on the Canal Commission 20 years ago. He was a man I respected. I have heard what is being said in town, and I find I do not believe it, and I have learned to attend to what I do not believe." "Many believe it, my lord," she said. "It would be simpler for you to be among them." "I have rarely found the truth to be simple," he said. "May I see the deed?" She had not expected that. She had expected sympathy which she could not have borne, or curiosity which she despised. She had not expected a man to ask on the first afternoon to see the evidence. She fetched it. He read it standing at the window in the gray light, slowly, his face giving back nothing. And when he had finished, he laid it on the table, with a care that told her more than any speech could have. "This is sound," he said. Drawn 3 years before his last illness, witnessed by his own attorney and his physician, lodged in town. No court in England would set it aside on a whisper. Your cousin knows that, which is why he is not attacking the deed in court at all. He is attacking you in the only court that will hear him without proof, the court of the season. "I know it," she said. "Then you know," he said, "that you cannot answer him in the country. The verdict was passed in town. It must be reversed in town." He paused, and for the first time something moved behind the gray of his eyes. Gone almost before she saw it. "The Queen holds a drawing room the 2nd week of December. You were presented at court on your marriage. You have the right to attend. He will not expect you to use it. You would have me walk into the one room where every voice that has condemned me is gathered," she said. "In mourning, alone. I would have you walk into it," he said, "as the woman who runs the best-kept estate in the county, while the man who slanders her cannot pay his tailor. I have made inquiries, your grace. I know what Calbourne thinks it knows. I also know what your steward's books say and what your tenants say when a stranger buys them no wine. You have a defense your cousin cannot touch, because it is true, and it is visible, and it does not require you to deny anything." He took up his hat. "You need only let it be seen in the one place that decides such things. I came to tell you that you are not without a friend at court, and that the friend believes you should fight. The choosing is yours." He bowed and was gone, and she stood a long while in the cooling library. the deed on the table, and found that her breath came differently than it had in 11 weeks. What she did not yet know was that he had not made his inquiries for the crown. He had made them for himself, after a single dinner in town, where a man he disliked had laughed at a poisoner duchess over the wine, and he had set down his glass and found he could not let it pass. She did not decide that night, nor the next. She was not a woman built for impulse. She went over it as she went over everything, by candle, in the cold, weighing it as she would weigh a tenant's plea against the rent. To go to court was to expose herself to a public stripping. To stay away was to confirm the verdict and surrender the estate by slow attrition, for Quintrell had already begun to test the deeds sideways, calling on the Calbourne attorney, hinting to the bank, applying the soft, constant pressure of a man who knows that a friendless woman can be worn down where she cannot be beaten. If she stayed, she would lose by inches. If she went, she might lose all at once. She might also win. She thought of the old Duke, who had handed her the books because he trusted her arithmetic over his stewards. She thought of the widow Estcourt's mended chimney. She thought of the word "turned face" up in the empty library. And she found that the cold clarity that had always been her fortune had, somewhere in the long, quiet weeks, hardened into something she had not had before, which was resolve. She wrote to the Marquess of Brightwell that she would attend the Queen's drawing room. Then she did a thing that the county had, it's seen it, would have read as proof of everything. She wrote to her late husband's man of business in town, and instructed him to sell out a portion of the funds that were hers by the deed, and with the money she ordered, from the best modiste in the kingdom. A gown. Not a black gown. The half-mourning of a widow 11 weeks bereaved, permitted gray, lavender, the soft retreat of muted color. Clorinda, though, had calculated something the county had not. The whisper had buried her in the costume of guilt, the bowed black figure at the gate, the penitent who walks the lanes. To answer it, she would not creep into court in apologetic gray. She would enter it as what she was, a duchess in her own right, and she would do it in silk, the precise dove and silver of half-mourning worn, without a single bowed line, cut by a hand that knew the body should be carried like an argument. The modiste, a shrewd Frenchwoman who had dressed 3 queens and feared no rumor that paid in coin, understood her at once. "You wish them to see a woman who has nothing to hide," she said, pinning. "We will not hide her then. We will make the room come to her. I wish them," Clorinda said, "to see a woman who has been working while they were talking." The gown was finished the first week of December. Quintrell heard of her intention because Quintrell had paid to hear of everything, and it frightened him more than he let his face show. A woman who hid confirmed his story. A woman who walked into the Queen's own drawing room did not behave like a woman with a grave at her back. He moved at once. And he moved well, because whatever else he was not idle in his own cause. He went to town ahead of her. He called upon the Dowager Lady Norbury, the most quoted woman in the season, a widow of 70 who had buried 2 husbands and the reputations of 100 younger women, and who held her place at court the way a sentry holds a bridge. He laid his hints before her as a man lays out his best plate, the damaged ledger, the affidavit unshown, the discharged nurse who would say what she had been bought to say. He did not ask Lady Norbury to accuse anyone. He asked only that she not be deceived by a pretty gown, and that she remember, when the Duchess appeared, what a careful man had reason to fear. Lady Norbury, who loved nothing on earth so much as being the keeper of a secret. Too dreadful to repeat. Took the bait whole. "I am told she means to come," Lady Norbury said to the circle around her chair in the week before the drawing room, her voice carrying, as it was built to carry, every head inclining to catch it. "The Marlbeck woman, in silk. I hear. They say she married him in the spring and had him in the ground by the wet of summer. And now she means to wear out her mourning at the Queen's own elbow. Well, we shall all be very interested to look at her." She tapped her fan against her wrist. Very interested indeed. A poisoner in this room. One does wonder what the age is coming to. It was the second voicing. And it was the most dangerous, because it was spoken in the heart of the season to the women who governed it. And by the time the drawing room came, the verdict had crossed from the country into the marble. Brightwell heard of it too. He went to see her the evening before, in the room she had taken in town, and he was graver than she had yet seen him. "Norbury has taken your cousin's part," he said. "She will be at the Queen's elbow tomorrow. She will not accuse you. That is beneath her. But she will be cold, and the room reads her temperature the way a sailor reads the glass. If she freezes you, the room freezes you, and your cousin wins without lifting his hand. You should know it before you decide finally to go in." "You are giving me a last chance to draw back," she said. "I am giving you the truth," he said. "I find I cannot do otherwise with you." It was the nearest he had come to anything unguarded, and he seemed to feel it, and his jaw set, and he looked away to the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was level once more. "But I will tell you what I have not told you. The discharged nurse. Your cousin has paid her to be present tomorrow, in an antechamber, ready to be produced if the room turns your way, to swear before witnesses that she saw you measure a powder. He has thought of everything. He has even thought of your courage." The fire cracked. Clorinda sat very still. She had not known about the nurse, and the knowledge ought to have undone her, and instead, slowly, it did the opposite. For the nurse was the flaw. A rumor cannot be cross-examined. A living woman in an antechamber can. "What is her name?" Clorinda said. "Pruitt," said Brightwell. "Hannah Pruitt." "Wall." She nursed 2 nights only, in May, before the housekeeper turned her off for drinking the late Duke's cordial. Your cousin found her at a gin shop near the docks. And Clorinda began, very quietly, to smile, and Brightwell, watching her, felt something in his chest that he had not felt in years, and did not entirely welcome, because he was a man who had ordered his life around the absence of exactly that feeling. "My lord," she said, "will you do one thing more for me before tomorrow? Will you send a man tonight to find a woman called Mrs. Estcourt, a widow of Calbourne, and bring her to town by the morning? And will you have your man also fetch from the Calbourne apothecary not the damaged ledger, for that is past reading, but the apothecary's son, a boy named Job Taverner, who keeps the daybook in his own hand and was too small to be worth my cousin's bribing." Brightwell looked at her for a long moment. "You have known how to win this all along," he said. "I have known the shape of it," she said. "I needed someone who would believe me enough to act before he understood why. You are that man, my lord. I do not know why, and I have learned not to ask why, of the only kindness in a season." She rose. "Send your men. I have a gown to wear." The night before the drawing-room, in the cold antechamber of the rumor she had been buried in, the thing turned. He sent his fastest riders north on the dark road. And in her rooms, Clorinda sat up by the candle, not over the accounts this time, but over a single sheet on which she wrote, in her clear, small hand, the few things she would need to say, and the order in which she would say them, so that when the moment came, she would not have to find the words through the noise of her own heart. The Queen's drawing-room was held in the long gallery of the palace, and the December dark pressed at the tall windows while 1,000 candles answered it, and the heat of the gathered season rose to the painted ceiling and hung there, scented with wax and hothouse flowers and the particular cold sweetness of fear dressed as pleasure. They came in their hundreds, the peers and their ladies, the dowagers in their diamonds, the debutantes pale with their first terror, and they made the slow processional toward the dais where the Queen received them, and they talked, as such rooms always talk, beneath the music, of who was present and who was not and who should not have dared to be. Clorinda came late, by design. She had learned from the old Duke that a room is governed by whoever enters at last and least afraid. The doors at the far end opened when the gallery was full, and a stillness moved up the room ahead of her. Head turning to head, fan stilling against fan, the way wind crosses a field of standing corn. She came alone, for she had refused Brightwell's arm at the threshold, knowing that to enter on a man's arm was to enter as a woman who needed shelter, and she had decided to need nothing. She wore the dove and silver silk, and had caught the 1,000 candles and gave them back, and there was not one bowed line in her. From the crown of her dark head to the hem that whispered on the marble, she did not hurry. She did not search the room for a friendly face. She walked the length of the gallery in the great silence she had created, and she let them look, every one of them, at the poisoner they had been promised, and what they saw was a duchess. Quintrell stood near the dais in a new coat he had not paid for, and he watched her come and felt the room slipping, and he did the only thing a cornered man knows how to do, which is to strike before the ground is wholly gone. He stepped half a pace forward as she neared, and he pitched his voice to Carey, the wounded nephew, the guardian of his late uncle's honor, performing grief for the gallery. "Cousin," he said, "you are bold to come among us. Bolder than I think my poor uncle would have wished, God rest him, with the questions that still hang about his rooms unanswered." He turned a little, gathering the watchers, his voice thickening with a sorrow he had practiced. "There are those here who knew him. There are those who attended him. I had hoped to spare this house such matters, but a man's blood will speak. I say only what others whisper. Is it nothing that he was strong in March and in his grave by July, and his young wife the richer by an estate? I ask it as his nephew. I ask it as the only one left to ask." It was the third voicing, and he had chosen the cruelest ground for it, the open floor of the Queen's gallery. And he had made it a question which is harder to answer than an accusation, because it pretends to be reasonable. The room held its breath. Lady Norbury by the dais lifted her fan a half-inch, which was her signal to the season that the Duchess might now be cut, and 100 faces composed themselves into the cold that kills. Clorinda stopped. She let the silence stand one beat longer than was bearable. Then she spoke, and she did not raise her voice. And because she did not, the room leaned in to hear her, which was what she had wanted. "You ask it as his nephew," she said. "I will answer you as his wife." She turned, unhurried, so that she addressed not Quintrell but the room, the whole gathered season, the dais, the Queen herself, who watched from her chair with the still attention of a woman who had seen many such mornings. "My husband died of the heart and the lungs after a decline of 2 springs, attended by Dr. Marsworth of Colborne, who signed it so, and who lives, and who may be asked. The estate I hold, by a deed he drew 3 years before his illness, witnessed by his own attorney, lodged in town, which any man may read and no court will set aside. These are matters of record. My cousin does not dispute the record. He cannot. So he disputes me, in rooms where there is no record to contradict him. And he has bought the witnesses to do it." She paused. "He has bought one tonight. She waits in your antechamber. My lord, does she not? Shall we have her in?" The room made a sound, a single low intake, and Quintrell's face moved before he could govern it. "I do not know what you mean," he began. "Have her in," Clorinda said. And there was iron under the quiet now, and a gentleman near the door, half in curiosity and half in the cruelty of a crowd that has scented a turn, went and brought the woman in. Hannah Pruitt came down the gallery blinking in the candlelight, a thin woman in a borrowed bonnet. And she had been promised money and had drunk some of it already, and she had not understood that she would be made to say it here before the Queen, with the Duchess looking at her not in anger but in something worse, which was recognition. "Mrs. Pruitt," Clorinda said gently, "you nursed my husband 2 nights in May. You were turned off by my housekeeper for drink. My cousin found you near the docks and has paid you to swear you saw me measure a powder. I do not blame you. You are poor, and he is persuasive. And the docks are cold. I will only ask you to look at me. And say it now, to my face, before the Queen. On your soul, did you see me measure any powder? Or did you not? It is one thing to swear a lie in an antechamber for coin. It is another to swear it aloud in a blaze of candles to the face of the woman it would hang, with a Queen 3 yards off, and your own soul, the only thing you have left to sell." Hannah Pruitt stood in the great silence, and her mouth worked, and the bought words would not come because Clorinda had not threatened her. Clorinda had been kind to her. And kindness in that moment was the one weapon against which she had no defense. "No," the woman said at last, in a cracked whisper that the whole gallery heard. "No, your grace, I never saw it." There was nothing to see. He told me what to say. She turned, trembling, toward Quintrell. He gave me 3 guineas and a coat. The room did not gasp. It did something quieter and more final. It withdrew from Quintrell, the warmth going out of 100 faces at once, the way a tide goes out, leaving him standing alone on the open floor with his unpaid coat and his collapsing season. And he looked about him for the allies he had bought, and found that bought allies do not stay to drown. Clorinda was not finished. She had learned from the old Duke that a verdict reversed by a recanting witness is only half reversed, and the other half is proof. She raised her hand, and Brightwell, who had stood the whole while at the side of the gallery without a word, watching her with an expression no one in that room could have read, brought forward a Calborn widow in her best dark gown and a frightened boy of 14 clutching a worn day-book to his chest. "This is Mrs. Estcourt," Clorinda said, "whose chimney I mended in September, and who walked through the night to be here. Ask her what manner of woman keeps the Calborn farms. And this is Job Taverner, the apothecary's son, who keeps the day-book his father did not think worth damaging, because he did not think a boy worth bribing. It records every powder dispensed to my husband's house in the spring. There is no poison in it. There never was. My cousin damaged the ledger his father kept. He did not know. The boy kept his own." She looked at Quintrell then fully for the first time, and there was no triumph in her face. Which was the thing that finished him? "You should have bought the child too, cousin. You bought everyone else." Quintrell's mouth opened. Nothing came. The florid confidence had drained from him and left a man the room could see plainly at last. A debtor in a borrowed coat who had wagered a great estate on the silence of the poor and lost it to a duchess who had simply, all along, paid attention. Lady Norbury's fan came down. The queen, on her dais, inclined her head a precise half-inch toward Clorinda, which the entire season saw and understood, and the cold that had been built to kill her broke and reformed itself, in the space of 3 heartbeats, into the warmer current that protects the vindicated. It was then that Lattimore, Marquess of Brightwell, crossed the open floor. He did not hurry. He came to her through the parting crowd in his dark blue and his white cravat, and he stopped before her, and he bowed, and then he turned and faced the room, the whole gathered season, and the queen upon her dais. And he said the thing he had carried unspoken since a dinner in November, where a man he disliked had laughed over the wine. His voice was low, and it was level, and it carried to the painted ceiling. "I mean to marry the Duchess of Marlbeck." That was all. 7 words in the silence of the gallery, spoken by the one man at court whom no one had ever known to be bought, or flattered, or mistaken, and they fell on the room, like the closing of a great door. He had matched nothing of Quintrell's cruelty. He had made no speech. He had simply set his name and his unimpeachable honor beside hers. In the one arena where the verdict had been passed, and the season, which trusted his judgment as it trusted nothing else, took the 7 words as the final overturning of everything it had believed for 11 weeks. Clorinda looked up at him. The cool composure that had been her armor for so long did not save her now, and she did not wish it to. "My lord," she said very low, so that only he could hear. "You did not ask me." "No," he said, the carved jaw easing by a fraction that only she would ever see. "I find with you, I cannot do otherwise than say the truth and hope. Will you have me, Clorinda?" It was the first time he had used her name, and he had chosen to use it there, in the blaze of the Queen's candles before the whole world that had buried her, and it undid the last knot in her that the long autumn had pulled tight. She had come into the room needing nothing and no one, and she had been right to. And now, having proven she could stand alone, she found she no longer wished to. "I will," she said. Quintrell did not stay to hear it. He had already gone, slipped from the gallery into the December dark, and the season did not trouble itself to watch him go. He was not destroyed. He kept the empty title and the crumbling seat, for the law gave him those, and he carried his debts north, and was not spoken of again in any room that mattered, which to a man who had staked everything on being spoken of was its own quiet ruin. Hannah Pruitt was given a place in a decent household by a duchess who did not believe the poor should hang for being poor. The Calburn attorney who had taken Quintrell's hints into the bank found his welcome there grown cool, and the Dowager Lady Norbury, who had lent her cold fan to a lie, sought out Clorinda within the week, not to apologize, for women of 70 who govern seasons do not apologize, but to be seen taking her hand in a crowded room, which, in the language of that world, was the same thing. Who had no use for cruelty even toward those who had been cruel to her. Let her take it. They were married quietly at Calbourne in the new year, in the small grey church where Dr. Marsworth had buried the old Duke, and the village that had cut her came to stand in the lane, and this time the carriages stopped. It was the widow Estcourt who put the thing into words, on a bright, cold morning that spring, when the Marchioness of Brightwell, as she now also was, walked the home farm with her husband at her side, and her steward's book under her arm. The Estcourt children ran the lane ahead of them in the clean March light, their coughs gone with the mended chimney, and Mrs. Bride, Estcourt, stood at her door and watched the Duchess pass, and said to the woman beside her, loud enough to be meant, "There she goes, the one they buried alive. In talk and look. Come back up out of it in silk." She wiped her hands on her apron. Worth survives. In the end. It only takes the right pair of eyes to dig it out. Clorinda heard it, and did not turn, and walked on with the book under her arm and the spring sun on the silver of her hair where it had begun. That hard year to come. Brightwell walked beside her in silence for a time, his hand at the small of her back where the room could not see it, and did not need to. At the gate of the home farm, the same gate where she had stood in black in October and watched the carriages refuse her, he stopped, and she stopped with him, and they looked together down the lane toward the village that had changed its mind. "They will say now that they always knew," he said, "that they never truly believed it. Let them," she said. "It costs me nothing, and it gives them back their comfort. I did not do it to be believed by them." She looked up at him, the gray eyes. She had learned to read the carved jaw, she had learned to watch for its rare easing. "I did it because the bread was real." He did not answer that at once. He was not a man who answered quickly. He looked at her in the March light, the woman who had walked alone the length of the Queen's gallery, rather than lean on his arm, and who had asked him, before all that world, why he had not asked her first, and he found that the thing he had ordered his whole life around the absence of had moved into the center of it and made itself at home, and he did not mind. "Come inside," he said, which was the kind of command she had once mistaken for coldness in him and now knew for what it was. "It is cold, and you have walked the whole farm, and there is a fire." She went in. On the table in the warm hall lay the old Duke's deed, kept now not as a weapon, but as a thing she was fond of, and beside it the small worn daybook the boy Joe Taverner had kept in his careful hand, the plain honest record that no one had thought worth damaging, which had outlasted every grander lie. She had buried nothing and dug up everything. The carriages stopped at her gate now. Yet it was the fire she went toward, and her husband's hand, and the quiet, ordinary, hard-won warmth of a house that was, at last, entirely her own. If Clorinda's long climb up out of the talk has stayed with you, sit a moment with the thought of who in your own life was buried that way, and dug out, and made whole. The fire in that hall is still burning. It only ever needed someone to keep it.